Hello everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be going over our second part of working with objects. So I had recorded a previous video working with objects part 1, which was getting into sort object, measure object, and where object. And this video here is going to be a continuation of the common commandlets that we're going to be using to work with objects in the pipeline. So in here, we're going to be talking about the difference between selecting and enumerating and looking at a couple commandlets here. The first one being select object and the other one being for each object. So select object does better for selecting, and for each object does a better job of enumerating. And for each object is going to have a couple different syntaxes on it. We're going to have the basic syntax and the advanced syntax. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into it here. So looking at my lab environment here, um, we have these two commandlets we're going to be talking about. Now, the first thing to get into is the difference between selecting and enumerating. And that's something that a lot of people struggle to grasp the concept of when it comes to PowerShell. Like, what is the actual difference? So let's say, for instance, I have a commandlet that's producing some type of output, putting some type of object into the pipeline. So maybe I'll grab a single service and I go ahead and I run that. Now, if I pipe this over to get member, we could see, for instance, that this commandlet is producing a service controller object, and that service controller object has a bunch of methods and a bunch of properties on it. Okay, so properties again represented facts about an object, and methods represent actions you can take against that object. Now, we're not, and in no way should we be familiar with every object in the .NET framework. Likewise, you don't necessarily have to be familiar with every method that you find here, right? So depending on what we're doing, you might not know what every method is about here. But you should have an idea of maybe what a few of them are. So for instance, like start and stop, if I'm starting a service or if I'm stopping a service, those are methods I can use to achieve that. And likewise with the properties, again, we might not know what every property is, but the properties again represent the facts about an object. Okay, now when you are selecting, you are working on the properties only. And you are, in essence, making a choice of what properties you want to keep and which properties you want to get rid of. Okay, that's what selecting is. Okay, there is a way to select to pick what kind of objects you want to keep as well, but for the most part, you're going to be using select to pick what properties you want to keep. Now, you might be asking, well, why would I want to do that? Well, imagine if you're making a report of all of the services running on a computer and you want to save this as maybe a nice HTML document. So with that being the case, you wouldn't want all of these properties to be there. Right? So, if you're making a report, you maybe don't care about container, can stop, can shut down, can pause and continue, services depended on, site. You don't care about a lot of those. If you're making a report, maybe all you care about is like the name, the status, and maybe the start type, and that's it. Maybe machine name, right? That's only four of like the dozen that are here. Right? Now, sometimes it's easy to get confused with this because you look at the screen output and you only see three properties and you're thinking, well, that's exactly what I want. But remember, that's not what's in the pipeline. So if you have a commandlet that produces an object, that object goes into PowerShell's pipeline, kind of like a space in memory reserved for running, for storing .NET objects. And then if you don't do anything else with it, like if I don't pipe this over to another commandlet, keep in mind that the .NET object gets written out to the screen, and there's a amount of rendering that has to happen to it. Okay, so you don't see all of the properties by default. Usually, when a .NET object is written out to the screen using like PowerShell's, let's say, defaults here. So within PowerShell, there is something called a view defined, which tells PowerShell, hey, if there's this kind of object in the pipeline, output it either as a table or a list with certain properties on it. Right? So PowerShell has a bunch of these default outputting rules that it uses. However, if you skip that and you output this some other way, so like let's say for instance I pipe this to let's do export CSV. So I'm going to write this data to a CSV file and maybe save this to a folder somewhere. We'll call it out1.csv. Right? So if I go ahead and look at that, let's see here, C colon data out1 CSV. So let's maybe open this with, just keep it simple, open it with Notepad, and we could see there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? So if we look at this, we see all of the properties written out here. And if this was the basis for what I was going to make a report off of, there's a lot of extra stuff in here that I might not be interested in. Right? So with selecting allows me to maybe, keep control of what I want to keep on the object in the pipeline and get rid of the stuff that I don't. Right? But with selecting, you're still retaining that object. Okay, so whatever it is, that's kind of what you're holding on to. Right? Now, the opposite of selecting is enumerating. So when you're enumerating can do one of two things. So the first off with enumerating is you can enumerate a method to basically use it, to activate it. So if I wanted to use the start method, I would not select it, I would enumerate it. And the second thing that enumeration can do is to grab the value out of a property. So grab the data out of a property and get rid of everything else. So for instance, if I just wanted like the names, notice how that's stored as a string object. I could enumerate that property and that would put the strings back into the pipeline. Whatever the service name, whatever the data was in the service name property would put that back into the pipeline and get rid of the service controller. So when you enumerate a property, you're taking the contents of it and making that what's in the pipeline now and getting rid of everything else. Okay, which can be a handy trick to know about, especially if you need to use parenthetical expressions or you're piping data in and you might be working with one type of object, but you need the data in its form to be able to send it to another commandlet, let's say. Right? So imagine, like if you had this, the service controller in the pipeline, but you needed to send the service names as strings over to another commandlet because it would only accept strings. So you can enumerate that to grab that data out of there. Right? So with that being said, let's look at kind of the two different ways of working with selecting and enumerating. All right, so the first commandlet we're going to talk about here is select object. So let's say here I have just a few services to work with here, right? And let's kind of run this here through the select object commandlet. So with select object, it has a way of basically saying what objects get to stay in the pipeline. It's not as advanced as doing the filtering that we had talked about in the previous video. So in working with objects part one, However, with select object, I can specify like if I want the first one, and then that would keep the first object in the pipeline in however order they were sorted. So that would be this one right here. It would keep that in the pipeline and get rid of the rest. Okay, and if you let it output to the screen, that's what you're going to see. Okay, or there's also a last parameter as well. Okay, so you could do last, and maybe I want the last two. And notice it's keeping, again, the last two from however the data was sorted. Okay, and you could also do a skip and tell it to skip a certain amount, like skip the first, skip the first one. And notice you get the rest of how they were sorted initially in the pipeline. Okay? So if you know you want the first amount of something from a list of objects in the pipeline or the last amount of something, these work great. Okay, the first, last, and skip. Okay, but it's still working with whole objects. Okay, so it's working with the entirety of a service controller. So even though I did select object, if after that I pipe it to get member, I could still see there's all the stuff on it. Right? Properties and methods and all of that. Okay. So the other way, and the by far the more popular way that we use select object, is with the property parameter. And with property, you get to pick what properties you want to keep, and PowerShell will get rid of everything else. So if I pick, for instance, of the objects in the pipeline, the service controller objects in the pipeline, okay, because that's what's in there, with all these methods and all of these properties. If I go tell it property, I want name and status, and I hit enter, that's what I get. Now, this isn't just doing screen output, okay? So some of you might think, oh, it's the same as doing like format table or format list. No, it's not. So if I pipe this to get member, it's still the service controller in the pipeline, and I've gotten rid, or it's gotten rid of everything except the two properties I told it to keep around. Okay? So all of the methods that are specific for a service controller were basically blown away. Now, you get a couple generic methods here that are basically on every object, so don't really worry about that, okay? So what we're mainly focused on here is the properties. So we went from, like however many properties were here to now we're just looking at two right here. So we selected what properties we want to keep, right? And that alters the data from the pipeline, removes what we don't want, keeps what we do, and puts that back into the pipeline. Right? So that's your primary use here of select object. You pick what properties you want to keep. Right? Now, with select object, it does have some abbreviations on it. So number one, property is a positional parameter, so you can get rid of that. Again, if you're not familiar with what positional parameters are, mandatory versus optional parameters, have a look at my video on using help. I go over all of that in there. And select object also has an alias of just select. So I can just run something like this. Right? Now, with this, you can also, instead of picking what properties you want to keep, you could also use select object to force all of the properties to show up on the screen. So let's say, for instance, I don't want to do this for all these services, but let's say I just have a particular service, like one. Okay, so there's one object in the pipeline. And let's say I want to see all of the properties that are on it. Okay, so one way to do it is what we've already learned. We can pipe it over to get member. And that would show me the properties, what the names of the properties are and what kinds of objects are in there, what kind of data is in there. Right? So that could be helpful in and of itself. However, it's sometimes useful to see a bit more than that. So instead, I can send this over to select object and do property star. And that would show me all of the properties and what their values are, okay, for whatever object was in the pipeline. Right? Now, again, we could abbreviate this down. So instead of doing select object property star, I could just literally just do select space star. So select being the alias for select object, and the star, even though it doesn't look like it, that's a string value, string object, and string objects get sent over to the property parameter. That's how that positional parameter works. All right, and there we go. All right, so we could see all of the properties on whatever object is in the pipeline. All right, so that can definitely come in handy as well. Okay, if we want to see what's actually there. Okay. Now, believe it or not, select object can also allow me to make my own properties as well. Okay, so we can do something that's called calculated properties. So we went over this a bit earlier, okay, when we were looking at working with objects as well. If I wanted to make my own property, so here, let's say, for instance, let's do something like this. Let's say I'll do get volume, right? And we could see here on this lab computer, there's a few different volumes here, but maybe I want to focus just on my C drive here. All right, so let's maybe do a filter on that. So let's do where object property the drive letter equals C, and there we go. And then let's say I wanted to see some information, right? So maybe a drive letter, file system type. Oops, I should probably have used select on this. Select object and property. There we go. And file system type and maybe size remaining. Okay. So let's say we do something like that. Now, if your eyes are sharp here, you may have noticed that when I just let get volume do its default display, so when I don't mess with it at all, and filtering's not really messing with it, okay? So when you just let it do its default output, you'll notice that size remaining is kind of, it's sorted or it's converted into different units. But notice when I do selecting and I grab like the actual property, it's not in that same format here. So what happens sometimes is when you let the default .NET object display to the screen, again, PowerShell has its own views defined, and the view could modify how the data looks. So in this case, it's converted from bytes over to gigabytes. However, when you do your own selecting of it, you're grabbing the raw values, and PowerShell is not providing any of that formatting. So this is where, like, if I wanted to do this, I would have to modify this property, okay, if I wanted to do that. So that's where calculated properties can come into play. So for that one property, I want to make my own or modify that information. So for doing a calculated property, you start with a hash table, right? And then inside the hash table, you establish two name value pairs. So the first one is what you want your property to be called. Now I could use the same exact property name if I wanted to. So I could use size remaining, but I'm not going to. So let's do name equals, and let's say I'll call my property free space, right? Like so. And then a semicolon, and then my expression. So the expression is going to be what the data part is. So that goes into its own element called a script block. So I'll just type out the script block, and then inside of it, I'll say I want to take the object in the pipeline, then dot and the size remaining property, and I want to divide that by 1 GB. So PowerShell knows what some of these units are. So I don't want to ruin that. But if I bring up another PowerShell here, notice if I type 1 GB, PowerShell knows how many bytes that is. So I can actually use that to do conversion here. 1 MB, 1 KB, 1 TB. It knows how many bytes are in each of those units. Right? So I'm going to take what's there and divide it by 1 GB, and then I'm going to cast it as an integer because I want a whole number. Right? So integers by default are whole numbers. So we'll go ahead and run that. And then there's my new property that I created with the value that I told it to use. Okay, now calculated properties, you can do a bit of abbreviation on them. So for instance, expression can be just written as E equals, and then where you're naming the property, that can just be N equals. Okay? You can also do the naming of the property for whatever reason, the key value pairs or the name value pairs that you use. It could be name equals, N equals, label equals, or L equals. So there's a lot of different variants for this, but it's always E or expression equals for the actual data part of it. So again, I run that and notice it's the same. All right? So that allows me to pretty much take whatever's in the pipeline and add or modify my own properties onto there if I wanted to do that. So for instance, like if I pipe this to get member, you'll see that for the object in the pipeline, the sim instance object, we have drive letter, file system type, and free space. Right, so we picked drive letter and file system type as they stood, and free space we created on our own using calculated properties. Right? Now, one of the last things that we can do with select object, so thus far we have been selecting, we've been working with the object in the pipeline. Okay, working with the properties specifically here. But also, select object can also enumerate as well. Okay, so like let's say, for instance, let's go back to the services here. And let's say select object property service name. All right, so let's say I want to do that. Okay, so let's say ultimately I want the value that's in the service name property. Okay, let's say that's what I want. So by doing selecting though, I'm not getting that. If I pipe this to get member, notice I started off with a full service controller here with all of the properties, piped it over to here, and this is still going to leave me with a service controller just with a single property on it, and the get member will show that. So service controller, just a single property. So that's again selecting, not enumerating. So when you do select, you're keeping the original object in the pipeline. And then you're just kind of messing with how many of it or how many properties, but the original object that you started with is still there. Okay, and the way to tell if you don't want to always pipe things to get member is look at the output. If you see a column header and then your value, that tells you that the raw value is not in the pipeline. It's a property of some other object that's in the pipeline. And that object has a service name property. So whenever you see a column header and then your value, you don't have that object in your pipeline, like the string that represent bits. It's a part of, or it's a property of whatever the object is in the pipeline. But again, if I want just the string bits, I would need to enumerate it. So select object could actually do that. It can enumerate properties if I want to. Um, and you use a different parameter to do it. So you use the parameter expand property. And then notice, okay, so we ran this up here. Notice the output. Now I'm about to run this and hit enter. Notice the output. See how it's different. Okay, I don't see a column header and then the value, I just see the raw value. So that's been enumerated. Okay, and if I pipe this to get member, you will notice that I started here as a service controller, but this time when I run this and pipe it to get member, this put a string into the pipeline. So it literally went to the service controller that was there, grabbed the value out of the service name property, which was a string object, and put that string object back into the pipeline and got rid of the service controller that was in the pipeline. Okay, so this produced the service controller, this grabbed the string out of the service name property, put that into the pipeline, and then that's what the get member is showing. So I just have the string. So that's doing an enumerating. Okay, so select object can do that. All right, now one of the things though that select object is limited to, it only works with properties though. So I can enumerate a property, but I cannot use select object to call methods at all. Okay. So with that being said, let's look at the other commandlet that enumerates, and that would be for each object. So let's start back here. Okay, so this was me enumerating with select object, and let's use let's do the exact same thing, but we'll do this with for each object, and I'll use the basic syntax to do it. So I'm going to call for each object, and the parameter I want to use on it is member name, which might seem confusing, but remember that for an object in the pipeline, it has a membership to it. So the membership would be all of the methods and all of the properties that are on whatever objects in the pipeline. So in this case, if I say membership and I want service name, that will grab me that value. Right? And again, if I pipe this to get member, it is in fact grabbing that string object. So that's what I ran, piped it to get member, and I can see there's a string in the pipeline. Right? So this was enumerating with select object and enumerating with for each object. Right? So if I wanted to do that. Okay, now let's say though I wanted to enumerate for the purpose of running methods, if I wanted to do that. Okay, so let's say for instance here, let's go back to my get service commandlet, pipe it to get member, and I can see that on a service controller, there's a few methods here. Okay, and there is a start method and a stop method. Okay, so let's say I want to use one of those. Okay, so first of all, let's see what bits is at here. Okay, so it's currently stopped. So let's say I want to use the start method. So I can come over here to for each object, member name, and we'll call the start method. Right? Now, when calling methods, though, there is something we have to be aware of that are arguments. Okay, so if I look here at start and I look at the details here in the definition on the right, I can see that there's a start and then an open and close parentheses. That specifies what the arguments are. So for instance, the start method can be run without supplying any arguments. So that's an empty argument list. So it could also have an argument list that has strings and other arguments in it. So how would you learn more about those? You'd go look up in the .NET framework. You can, pop it into a search engine and go that route. But you'd go look up system.serviceprocess.service controller in Microsoft's documentation, and it would tell you all about the arguments that went with each of these methods. So this is kind of a summary view of it. So it's not made to give a complete story. That's what further documentation could be for. But the point I want to make here, though, is start does not need an argument. Okay, so it's fine without any arguments. So with that being said, this is all I have to type. All right, so the member name start. So in this case, PowerShell is going to see that that is a method rather than a property, and it will run that method. So I go ahead and do that. And now if I bring up bits again, I can see it did in fact start it. All right. So that's calling that method. Now let's say I wanted to do something else here. So maybe like I've got Notepad running down here. So let's see if I can isolate on that. So let's do get process. And let's see, what is the column header process name? So get process, and maybe we'll do we have a name? Yeah, notepad.exe, or how about just notepad? Okay, there we go. And we'll take notepad, pipe that to get member, and see if there are some methods here. And there are. Right? So, and notice there is a kill method right here. So that's how you basically terminate a process. Right? It's almost like the same thing as if you, pulled up Task Manager, found Notepad and ended the task, right? So we're basically doing the same kind of thing here. So we could take this, send it to for each object, member name, we'll do kill, and then, oops, I don't want to kill every process. No, there we go. And then watch my notepad icon right down here. Okay, run it, and then notepad just went away. So that activated that particular method. All right. Now, let's say though, I wanted to use a method that took an argument, right? Something that took an argument. So let's say, for instance, I had some data that was in a string object. So let's say I'll put my name in quotes here. So if you hit enter, you notice it outputs that, but more importantly, I'm producing if I pipe it to get member, I'm producing a string object. And on the string object, maybe I wanted to do something where I grabbed just a portion of the string. Okay, so maybe I want to use this substring method. And if you notice, it takes some arguments. Okay, so I could do the start index, or I could do a substring with the start index, and then how much I want to keep. That's kind of being truncated off right there, but that is an argument that I could use. So to do this, I could hence send this over to for each object. Member name was substrings. That's the name of the method. And then the argument I want to start at the beginning of the string, and I want the first two characters. So those are my arguments. And then notice it gets the beginning and the first two characters. So that's the argument list that was supplied. All right. Now, so with this, we could supply arguments to potentially any of the methods that are there if we wanted to do that. Okay, and in fact, you can even kind of, how shall we say, stack these up if you wanted to. Like, let's say I wanted my services. Let's say I had a bunch of services and I just wanted the names and I wanted them as uppercase. So if you notice on a string object, there is a toUpper method. All right. So let's go ahead and call that. So first of all, I need the strings to be in the pipeline. So that means we could do for each object, member name, and let's grab service name. All right, so that's all the services. Right, there we go. And just to verify I got that, we'll pipe it to get member and notice string objects. Okay, so next, so that gets me my string objects, and I then want to call the toUpper method. So we'll do for each object, member name, toUpper. Oops, that's not UUpper, toUpper. There we go. Okay, and there we go. So they're now been converted to uppercase. Okay, I apologize for the carriage return right there, but anyway. So that's what, maybe make that a little bigger. There we go. So that's what happened, right? So the first for each object grabbed the strings out of service name, put those in the pipeline, and then this for each called the toUpper method for those string objects. Right? Now, so this might seem a bit unwieldy, but one of the things to keep in mind is some of this could be abbreviated. So for instance, believe it or not, there's a couple aliases here and positional parameters could be used. So for instance, member name is positional, and for each object can have an alias of just for each. So notice that works. And then also, for each object also has another alias, which is just, don't ask me who made this, but it's just percent. And then notice that works as well. Okay? However, let's say though, I wanted to do this, I don't want to say easier, but maybe in a more efficient fashion. Um, you can use the advanced syntax to go along with for each object. So for instance here, just to summarize this query down, let me, let me do this. Let's first of all bring back up the full syntax for what I just did, and then let's use the advanced syntax with for each object. And I only need one for each object to do this. So I'm going to use the process parameter, and process takes a script block. So in there, I'm going to call the object in the pipeline, because remember, when you're in a script block, you have variables that represent the objects in the pipeline, either $_ or $PS item. So I'll do $_ dot, and then I want to grab the property. I want to grab the service name property. So let's do that. And then I can do another dot and call the toUpper method from that. Okay, so you can kind of stack these things. So we looked at this yesterday when doing filtering, where you're doing sub expressions. So this represents the object in the pipeline, okay, put there by the previous commandlet, which would be this. So that would be the service controller. Then you've got your dot. This represents the property on that service controller. So, and again, this is enumerating. So this is grabbing the data out of the service name property. So in this case, that's string objects. So that's what this is producing right here. It's producing a bunch of string objects. And then another dot is my separator. And now this is calling the toUpper method from those string objects. And if I hit enter, it works. And in fact, you can even, again, put some abbreviation on this. So script blocks automatically go to the process parameter via positional, be the fact that parameter is positional, and then use the alias, and away you go there. Okay, so you can do this. Right? So I had, this up here, and just by using the advanced syntax, I can make it be one for each object rather than having to do it twice. One to grab the property and then the other to call the method on that property. Okay, now, when using the advanced syntax though, a couple things to keep in mind. So first of all, you're calling your object via a variable. So again, I use $_. And remember with for each object, when you're working with this, and if there's multiple objects in the pipeline, it processes them one at a time. So literally this script block here would run 4 times if there were 4 objects in the pipeline. Okay, so for each object does whatever you tell it to do, one at a time to each object in the pipeline. The second thing is when you're using the advanced syntax, you have to, and you're calling a method, you always have to supply an argument list even if it is empty. Okay, so like let's say for instance, let's go back to get service name bits. Let's see. So it's now stopped again. So let's say I want to start it. Okay, so we'll come over again to for each object. And in this case, we'll do the process. And let's say we'll do $_ dot start as the method, empty argument list, close the script block. And so that would start the bits service. So this was the service controller. This was calling the start method, and I'm supplying an empty argument list. Okay, so something like that. So if I look at bits, again, you could see it's running. Now, what if I wanted to supply arguments in that argument list? Okay, so let's say I wanted to, let's go back to this toUpper, which was doing that. And instead, maybe I didn't want to do toUpper. Maybe I just wanted some of the characters, but not all of them. So let's do substring, and then let's start at 0 and grab the first, I don't know, 3 characters. All right, so that I just grabbed the 3 characters that were there. So your argument goes inside the parentheses. All right, so that's a way we could call that whatever argument we needed to supply to whatever method we were using. All right. So that's some usages here of for each object, and specifically around the areas here of selecting versus enumerating. All right, so we looked at select object, which primarily does selecting, but you could use the expand parameter on it, the expand property parameter to do enumerating, and for each object, which primarily does enumerating. Now, the benefit of using for each object, like I mentioned, is you can use it to get at not just the data that's in properties, but also be able to call your methods as well. All right. So I hope everybody enjoyed this, and this will be the wrap here on my videos talking about working with the generic object commandlets. So in the first video in the series, we looked at sort object, measure object, and where object. And then here we're kind of finishing up with select object and for each object. So if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Greatly appreciate it. And if you like the content, check out some of the other videos I have here in my PowerShell Basics playlist or videos I'm putting together, and be on the lookout for some new stuff that'll be coming out soon as well. So once again, thanks for viewing, and we'll see you in the next video.